as we get underway. But welcome back for the third of our 4 seminars. And if it feels like the semester's been a bit rushed, it's probably because it has been. we've as it turned out, because of spacing these seminars and avoiding Easter and so on, we've done 3 of the 4 in the first 6 weeks, basically. So that could explain why it's feeling a bit like it's a tornado hitting at times, because we are sort of at the front end low. We're sort of hitting a lot of the content pretty well straight up. The converse of that is, of course, you'll have a lot more time to be relaxed about your final assessment items, or even possibly do other assessment items or do some reading around the subject. So welcome back. I'm conscious some of us are sort of in holiday mode because we work for schools and we're sort of feeling relaxed, and others of us are placed in parishes and are thinking we're about to go into the busiest week of the year and we're getting stressed, and others are just, like myself, are glad we're going to finish this week in a few hours' time, because it's been one of those weeks. One of the highlights of the week was the book launch, which was yesterday afternoon here. So if you're looking for a copy of the book, see me at the break and you can grab one of those as well. But it was a good gathering here yesterday as we gave the book its official launch. So what we're going to do today is basically focus on the prophetic literature, and we're looking at the prophetic literature through the lens of the way the Jewish people think about the Old Testament, or the Tanakh. Okay, so we're going to be looking at before morning tea we'll look at the former prophets, and then between morning tea and lunch we'll look at the latter prophets, which of course in our language are historical books and prophetic texts. Okay, so that's one of the things we'll be thinking about. So clearly an hour and a half for Joshua, Judges, Samuel, Kings, an hour and a half for Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and the Book of the 12 has to go down as an ice skating, skimming across the top of the lake world record attempt. But this is designed basically to open up the areas for you. So as you read into them, you've got some background. It's also a chance for us to ask questions. So don't be afraid to ask questions. Doesn't matter if we don't cover everything. What does matter is that you don't go away with a question you wish you'd asked. Okay? And if you do, make sure you ask it on Moodle, because probably someone else will be really glad you asked, even if they don't like my answer. They'll probably be glad that you raised it and conversation has started. So I thought we'd start with this interesting picture. It's one of my own photographs, so there are no copyright issues, and no, it's not me on a bad day at Bethsaida. Okay, but that might feel like that sometimes. This is a fairly common sight in certain villages and properties around the northern part of Israel in particular. And basically, remember, the northern part of Israel is also the southern part of Lebanon, historically. There just happens to be a dotted line with barbed wire and machine guns there at the moment, but for millennia, what we call northern Israel has also been the backyard for Tyre and Sidon, and the sort of southern patch of Lebanon. So the major Christian community in that part of Israel are in fact the Melkites, the Greek Catholics, because that part of the Greek Orthodox Church split with Constantinople, signed up with Rome in about the 18th century. And so the local Greek Orthodox, the local church, call them the King's Church, the Empire's Church, because they've gone with Rome. Hence Melkite, because Melech is king, and in Hebrew, and Malek is king in Arabic. So the Melkites are the Empire's Church, meaning the Roman Church, even though they're Greek in their liturgy and so on. So the Melkite community is strong in the Galilee and southern Lebanon. That's the Melkite part of Christianity. So when you're in Melkite territory, you'll often come across this particular statue. And at the break, I might even go and steal one of the other data projectors, because I think the lamp in this one is just about on its last legs and needs like our statue. So what's your response to that statue, and what does it say to you about the prophetic legacy of the Bible in that part of the world? What does that image evoke from you as you drive into a village or you go to a particular place and you see this statue? This particular statue is one of about 6 or 8 at the same location, which I'll tell you about in a moment. Okay, so this is a big theme for this particular location. But what's your response to an image like that?
Die, you scum.
Die, you scum. Yep.
Stay on the road.
That it was taken by force.
Yeah. Have you identified what the image represents, or statue represents? Okay. It's the prophet Elijah, slaughtering one of the 400 prophets of Baal, upon whose neck he has ever so gently placed his foot, while raising his sword. And the erstwhile prophet of Baal is about to have a close shave. All right. So what buttons is this designed to press? Interfaith dialogue doesn't come, like right to the top of the list when you drive into town and you see one of those at the first roundabout. Okay. One of the first of these I saw was actually the Christian village of Fasuta, which is right on the Lebanese border. It's one of 3 100% Christian villages left in Israel. And there's another
Sign that says, "Welcome to Fasuta, Tawny Town winner, 90."
heads will roll. This is a Christian town, and we don't want any non-Christian people here. That's what that actually is saying.
It also makes you think they must have had a lawful God.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's our God. That's Yahweh. Yahweh or the highway. Yep. Okay. So this is actually a sign of you've driven into a Christian village in northern Israel or southern Lebanon. So that's part of our legacy. That's part of our footprint in the Middle East. Okay? And it's not about the Multi-Faith Centre at Griffith University or the Interfaith Forum for Queensland Churches Together. This is we don't do that stuff here. No pagans, or in this case no Muslims, and preferably no Jews. Okay? So there's a dimension, and because you can probably see why this image came to mind, as we read through the prophetic literature, and especially as we start with Joshua Judges, okay, this is one of the themes of the prophetic literature. Now, it's a theme that makes us, I hope, uncomfortable. Okay, this is not good for communal relations. This is designed to stoke up sectarian violence and to claim a distinctive identity which takes no prisoners and does not accommodate difference. Okay, this particular one is from the, if I get the pronunciation right, Mukata, or Makata, which is this traditional site of Elijah's victory over the prophets of Baal on Mount Carmel. Okay, all that means, of course, is it's the highest bit of the mountain range, so that's the bit that gets claimed as the holy site. Okay, we haven't found the bodies of 400 dead prophets lying on top of the hill. Okay, but this is the place traditionally. So this church, sorry, not yet. Well, I think the dogs might have got them. Okay, but so this is the place where the Christians in this community, in this land, remember that particular event, and indeed Muslims and Jewish people remember that event as well. It's part of their sacred tradition. So this particular monastery, the grounds and the churches are littered with statues of Elijah chopping off the heads of the prophets of Baal. Okay, but every Christian village you go into, you'll find one of these at the first roundabout.
Were they all
Okay.
commissioned at the same time?
I don't know, but it's a.
Do you know when they were dated?
Oh, these are all sort of modern types.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, these are just sort of done in concrete and rock, and these are not ancient statues. This is the contemporary Christian population of Palestine and Lebanon think like this about their neighbours.
That makes sense. Yeah.
Okay, now go to Syria, and you can see why there's sectarian violence. Now go to Lebanon, and you can see why there's sectarian violence between the Muslim community and the Christian community, and the different factions within the Christian community and the different factions within the Muslim community. And then you introduce the Jews into the mix as well with Israel, and it's like everybody bring your own knife, we're having a party. Okay, So it's complex and it's violent. And while we tend to think of Jesus as sweet and mild and gentle, look at that thing on the wall behind me. Okay? Our tradition celebrates violence, redemptive violence, as if that's not an oxymoron. Okay? But the myth...
The root of the violence?
In what sense?
Survival?
I'm not sure what the root is. It's probably about wanting to take other people's land and wives or daughters, or it's about power and control more than survival, I suspect. And these are ancient conflicts, of course, that go back between sedentary people living in villages and other people moving through with flocks and herds, and you have different claims on the resources and so on. So it's not simply, this is not survival in the face of oppression. This is violence against neighbours. Okay. So, and it's, we live in a violent world. So, and we tend to think that our religion is about peace and niceness and gentleness and compassion, and hopefully it is. But even at the heart of even our tradition, there's an incredible moment of sacred violence in the cross, which of course is our focus next week. Okay. So it's not as if the Old Testament is full of violence and Christianity is like a Sunday school picnic. Okay, read the book of Revelation. Have we got a violent wrap-up plan for you guys, kind of thing? Okay. So the guy with the sword, with his foot on the throat of his enemy, is a face of Christianity we don't often look at. Okay, and don't acknowledge. So when we get a bit uncomfortable about the violence in the Old Testament, that's our Bible as well. It's not just the Jewish bit of the Bible that's violent. Okay. Yeah, and he needs a good scrub, obviously. There's been a bit of grime and stuff from Haifa settling on his forehead. Okay, so we're going to be looking at Joshua, Judges, Samuel, Kings. The first half of what's in the Jewish canon is called the prophets, or the Nevi'im, and that raises the difference in the canonical arrangements as we define our sacred texts. Okay, Christian Bibles, ever since Christian Bibles have existed, which basically takes us back to the Septuagint, or the Greek translation of the Bible, which of course is still the version of the Bible used in the Greek Orthodox Church. Okay. They don't have an NRSV or a New Jerusalem Bible or NIV. They still use the Septuagint. Okay, it's in Greek, and they can't read ancient Greek anymore, but the priests can. So that's a canonical arrangement that we're so familiar with the law, the historical books, and the sort of poetic books, and then the major prophets and the minor prophets. That comes out of the Septuagint. And it reflects a rearrangement of the canonical documents, of the sacred documents, into a different canonical form. So in the Septuagint, and therefore in the Latin Vulgate, and therefore in the King James Bible, and therefore in all the Bibles we're familiar with, it's Joshua, Judges, Samuel, Kings, okay, along with 1st and 2nd Chronicles, which some people here are working on, and of course Ezra and Nehemiah are seen as part of the historical books. And with the larger Old Testament canon, you also throw in Maccabees and so on, and 2nd Esdras as part of the historical books of the Old Testament. Okay, that's that point there. I know Tobit and Judith go in as well. Okay, and just a footnote. I think I just said 2nd Esdras, but 2nd Esdras is what we call Ezra Nehemiah, and 1st Esdras is what we tend to call 3rd Ezra. 3rd and 4th Ezra, which is in the Apocrypha. Okay, so the Ezras and Esdrases get confused, and they are confusing in terms of which is what. Okay, so that's the version of how we've dealt with these books, which has been familiar to literally generations, like 2,000 years of Christians have read these books this way. Okay, now that's a long time. So that way of reading this book has its own integrity and a long pattern of usage. Okay, that there's another pattern of usage which is even older, but not that much older, maybe only a couple of hundred years older, which is this Jewish way looking at these books, which treats Joshua, Judges, Samuel and Kings as the first half of the prophets, the former prophets, the latter prophets. And that invites us to see these texts not primarily as the history of ancient Israel, but as a prophetic word to ancient Israel, using the genre of storytelling in order to present the prophetic word. So it also cracks open the idea, so what's a prophet? Okay, a prophet is not a fortune teller, okay, sitting in the sort of open space at the shopping centre at Forest Lake and offering to read your palm or whatever. Okay, prophets are not primarily predicting the future as speaking to people with power in their own time. And in doing that, of course, they talk about the future, but they're really like sort of policy advisors saying, if you stay in the alliance with Egypt, then God is going to punish you by sending the Babylonians, and that will have consequences. Okay, but they're not primarily predicting the future movements of the Babylonian army. They're trying to give advice, direction to the ruler, to the person with power. And of course, it's the prophet's job to speak out, and it's the king's job to refuse to listen. That goes with the script. Okay, people with power tend not to listen to advisors except when they're saying what the people with power wish to hear. And it's a tricky game if you choose to be the unwelcome, to be the messenger of unwelcome advice. And it's historically in medieval Europe, that was partly the role of the joker. The joker could get away with saying things which the king would listen to that could never be said by the nobles, by the ministers of the king and the ministers of the church. But the joker could kind of slip something in.
The jester.
Sorry?
The jester.
The jester. Sorry, jester. Yeah, sorry. Joker is the jester. You're right. Yeah. Thank you. So we've got these first four scrolls, which in the Jewish way of thinking about them are prophetic texts. They constitute the former prophets. Now in our Bibles, there's 6 books, because Samuel is divided across 2 scrolls, Kings is divided across 2 scrolls, okay? But in the Jewish way of thinking, even though they're long enough that they go over 2 scrolls, they're still seen as the one book. Okay? So it's interesting when you say how many books are there in the Old Testament. Well, it depends how you count. Okay, and if as was true for the Jewish tradition, you want there to be the same number of books as there are letters in the Hebrew alphabet, then being able to combine books like Samuel and just count them once, that's good. Okay, that all helps. So we're dealing with books that we tend to think of as the books that give us the history of ancient Israel, because we're so obsessed with history and in a sense have mortgaged our idea of truth to historicity. But from a Jewish point of view, and from an ancient Jewish point of view, these are primarily prophetic texts. These are stories in which the prophets are speaking truth to power. And they're talking about the covenant. Okay, and they're calling for people and ruler to be faithful to the covenant. So let's look at we'll use the same model as we did last time. We'll look at it through the lens of the 3 worlds, the 3 windows, if you use a different metaphor, and we'll start by looking firstly at the ancient world, the world behind the text of the former prophets, Joshua, Judges, Samuel, Kings. You'll have those off by rote soon if I keep saying it. And then we'll look at the world within the text, and then we'll take a bit of time to begin the conversation around, so how do we from our world read these texts? Okay, how do they speak to us? So starting then with the world behind the text, one of the questions of course is, so how good are our manuscripts? For me this is always a basic question of data. What are we dealing with here, and how good are the texts? And of course for the major complete versions of the Hebrew Bible, we still have to go to Aleppo and Leningrad codices, and Aleppo is missing a fair bit of the Torah, but it certainly is complete when it comes to the former prophets. So by the 8th, 9th, 10th century, we've got solid Hebrew manuscript tradition. Of course, we've got the versions in the Septuagint, but one of the problems there is the Septuagint version, particularly of Samuel, is significantly different from the version found in the Masoretic text, which is the Hebrew tradition. Okay, so there are significant textual variations between the existing Hebrew and Greek ancient versions of the book of Samuel, and it's particularly true in the stories around David and Saul. When he goes off to fight Goliath and so on. That story is significantly different depending whether you're reading it in the Septuagint or in the Masoretic text. So your modern English Bible should have extensive footnotes saying these verses don't exist in some ancient versions or something like that, and that's what they're alluding to. We do have the Dead Sea Scrolls, so it's interesting to see what bits have randomly survived in that database, in that time capsule constituted by the Dead Sea Scrolls. And there are 3 Dead Sea Scroll manuscripts of Joshua. This doesn't mean that's the entire book of Joshua, but we have 3 fragments, 3 pieces of parchment which represent different copies, okay, of Joshua. So we know there are at least 3 versions of Joshua in their library. There are 4 copies of the book of Judges. There were 4 copies of Samuel, and there are 3 copies of Kings. So at least we know that the grumpy old priests at Qumran had this part of the Bible in their collection. Okay? And as we mentioned, I think a week before, last time we met, in the case of Samuel, not only are there the issues I was just alluding to in terms of the variant lengths and so on, there's that issue around the beginning of chapter 12 and so on, where you've got that's a missing paragraph about the Ammonites, which exists in the Qumran version of Samuel, doesn't exist in either the Masoretic or the Septuagint version of Samuel, but you'll find it put back into your Bible if you have an NRSV, and you'll find it not put back in your Bible, so you won't find it, if you've got an NIV, because they've answered the question differently. If this paragraph has not been in the Masoretic text, has not been in the Septuagint, has not been in the Latin Vulgate, and has not been in any modern European version of the Bible in the last 500 years, to what extent is this paragraph part of the Bible? Even if it was originally part of the book of Samuel. Okay, if it's been missing from the text that everybody's been reading for that long, do we put it back in the Bible or not? Okay, and so the NRSV has opted to put it back in, saying, well, it was dropped out because of an accident of manuscript transmission. The NIV has said, oh no, we're not going to do that. We're not going to add stuff to the Bible this late in the story. Okay, so there are philosophical and other issues to be addressed when you do find textual variants.
Excuse me, Greg. Are they 3 versions are they 3 copies of the same version, or are they 3 different versions? You know what you've got?
I've got 4 texts and so on. Yeah.
Are they just 3 copies of the same?
They're 3 manuscripts written, and they're not the same document. They're not just simply 3 bits of Samuel from different parts of Samuel. Even if they are from different bits of Samuel, they're different handwriting. So we know they're not from the same scroll. Okay, so they are fragments of what were once 3 separate copies or 4 separate copies of Samuel. And I haven't looked at this for a while, but my recollection is that the Dead Sea manuscripts for Samuel include both the long and the short forms of Samuel. And the same for Jeremiah, which also has a similar problem. In other words, what I take away from that is that the Masoretic text, the Hebrew tradition, has preserved one ancient Hebrew version of the documents, and the Greek text has preserved another equally ancient Hebrew version of the manuscripts, and they've got frozen in time in the Septuagint and the Masoretic, and we actually have no way of working out which is original, which matters to us since the Renaissance. Since the Enlightenment, we want to get back to the original. Well, we don't have the original. These are handwritten documents. Everyone's original. If you mean, I don't want a copy. Everyone is handmade. They're not mass-produced. So in the case, and so what that means in reality, if I go into my Accordance Bible software, for instance, just bring that up quickly, and we will do a bit more of this later. If I was to go into, say 1 Samuel, okay, there's 1 Samuel, then I can bring up over here, instead of having the normal biblical Hebrew text, I can go into... got to find where I've got it stored. That's the only thing. There we go. That run of Dead Sea Scrolls Bible canonical order. Okay. So if I scroll down, so obviously there's a whole lot of Samuel which doesn't exist in the Qumran text because the right-hand panel is empty. Okay. Let me just pull this further down so I've got more screen. But as I scroll through, I'll start to get stuff from Qumran popping up. Okay, now don't worry, but it's all in Hebrew and it's Greek to you and all that, I realise. So what we've got here is, there's a chunk from 1 Samuel 9 which comes from 4Q51. That means K4, Qumran, document 51. And there's a chunk which correlates to this passage in 1 Samuel 1. Then there's a gap, and there's still a 51, probably the other side of the thing. Okay, so that's 4Q51. So a whole lot of that, and then we're back into gaps again. Okay, so amongst the Samuel documents at Qumran is K4, Qumran, manuscript 51. As you can see, it's reasonably extensive. It's not just a fragment this big with 5 words that we've matched up with Samuel, but it also doesn't cover the entire text. As we go further through, if I kept scrolling through, we'd then come to other parts of Samuel which are paralleled or preserved on a different document, maybe Cave 4, maybe some other document. I just can't remember off the top of my head which ones they are. Okay, so you've got this textual variation going on. The fact that there are 3 texts of Joshua, 4 texts of Judges and so on is interesting and indeed incredibly valuable when it comes to taking random samples and checking how well the tradition has been preserved. And the takeaway message is, with the occasional blip, which is understandable, and in many cases Qumran allows us to correct the blips which we've already known about, but with the occasional problem here and there which you'd expect much more of, what the Dead Sea Scrolls are demonstrating is how well the document tradition has been preserved and managed over hundreds of years, which then actually says people treated these documents with exceptional care. That suggests they were already regarding these documents as having great spiritual value to them. So you get those other kind of secondary conclusions that come out of the textual criticism. Okay. But compare that with the fact that there are, and again look at the numbers, 28 to 30 copies of Deuteronomy preserved at Qumran. And the reason there's 28 that are definite, and there are 2 others that are probably Deuteronomy, but they're still debating. These are so fragmentary or in such bad shape that people are not entirely sure that it is Deuteronomy, or is it a fragment of a copy of Deuteronomy, or is it a fragment of a commentary on Deuteronomy, which has quoted the pet text but is not actually a text. Okay, so if the fragment is small enough, you don't know whether you're dealing with like someone's essay and all that survived is the paragraph that was indented. So have you actually got a copy of the original book, or have you got a fragment of someone's essay and it happens to be the fragment where they quoted the book? Okay, and they both are useful, because the fact that the people of Qumran were writing commentaries on Deuteronomy, wow, I mean that actually takes us back inside the Bible industry. People are not just writing the books, reading the books, using them in synagogue, almost said church, okay, but they've also got rabbis and scholars that are writing commentaries on the text and saying this passage means such and such and it applies to us today in this way. They're doing exegesis essays at Qumran, okay, and they call them peshas or pesharim. And because that's the Hebrew word meaning this is interpreted as, this means. So they call them pesharim or commentaries. So a commentary is actually very useful in terms of understanding the reception history of the text, and in some cases the commentary will preserve the most ancient quote from the missing text. Okay, so they're really important. So Deuteronomy, between 28 and 30 manuscripts, fragments that refer to Deuteronomy. Isaiah 21 and the Psalms, again, 35 to 37, same issue. So relative to Deuteronomy, Isaiah and the Psalms, the former prophets were not the most favourite reading list at Qumran. Okay, they didn't have as many copies in the library. But they had lots and lots and lots of copies of Deuteronomy and Isaiah and the Psalms. As I think I probably said last time, they're exactly the bits of the Old Testament which are quoted most often in the New Testament, which is interesting. So the people of Qumran, even though the Qumran people were not the early Christians and they weren't the followers of John the Baptist, but they were Jews from the Second Temple period whose spiritual impulse came from exactly the same part of the Jewish scriptures as we find reflected in the New Testament. So they're drinking the same water. Okay, they're drinking from the same well. Whereas if they were writing commentaries on Chronicles or something, we'd say, wow, we don't have much in common with them. Apologies to the Chronicles people in the room, but I mean, you'd say, what's that got to do with us? But when we see that they're getting excited about the same bits of the Old Testament as the New Testament writers are, then we begin to see there's some convergence here between early Christianity, which was out in the streets and the villages, and these monks who go off to the desert and hide from the world. Okay, so very different strategies, and yet they're motivated by the same parts of the Bible. So even reading the same bit of the Bible doesn't mean you'll come up with the same mission strategy. Synod might like to remember that sometimes. Okay, and I've already mentioned the Samuel scroll. Okay, form criticism. What we've really got in Joshua, Judges, Samuel, Kings, of course, is narrative. Primarily it's narrative. Stories. And particularly what Thomas Thompson called the traditional complex chain narrative, and I'll put up a couple of examples of that in a moment, but I'm afraid that's not going to come up well on the screen. We also find other genre there as well. We'll find lists. It may be lists of cities, it may be lists of tribute, it may be taxation lists, okay? It may be genealogies and so on, but we'll find lots of traditional information which has been gathered for some other purpose, presumably, and has been used by the storyteller as they're put together, as they've gathered up all this material and shaped it into this, what Thompson calls this complex chain narrative, using traditional materials. And there are songs. I mean, one of the sort of treasures of the of Joshua, Judges, Samuel, Kings, the former prophets, is we have a number of psalms embedded in these books. And not all of them are psalms that occur in the book of Psalms. So again, of course, I mean, if you think about it, of course, there were more than 150 songs in ancient Israel. Okay? And indeed at Qumran, there were more than 150 psalms in the book of Psalms. And they weren't the same as our 150. They are up to about 91, but after 91, they've got a different collection. Okay? So there are songs, and particularly the Song of Hannah in 1 Samuel chapter 1 and 2 is like the first draft of Luke's Magnificat when he comes to the Song of Mary. Okay? And if you read the Song of Hannah and the Song of Mary, it's like, somebody's been reading somebody else's essay. We also find speeches or sermons, and sermons are just a particular kind of speech, of course. So at strategic points through this, you get these speeches or sermons or even prayers, because sometimes prayers are really more for the people listening than for God. They're like the community notices. We pray for Mrs. Smith who broke her ankle at the shops this week. Oh, everybody knows Mrs. Smith has sprained her ankle at the shops this week. God already knew, of course, but now everybody in the church knows. So the long prayer by Solomon, inverted commas, at the dedication of the temple in 1 Kings chapter 8, for instance. It's a speech. And it rehearses the whole history of Israel down to the exile and beyond. And Solomon's giving the speech, the prayer. Okay, so presumably it's a strategic speech put in there by the editor to kind of map the terrain and put everything in context. So while superficially it presents as story about real people and actual places and things that really happened, and some of which did really happen, that's not the point of the stuff. And the fact that the Jewish people call this the former prophets reminds us it's about the prophetic edge to the story of God's people rather than simply the story of God's people. Okay? What's the story telling us rather than simply what's in the story? Slightly different nuance to that question. Okay? Questions? Yeah, I don't get to have a slurp of my coffee. Okay, so we've got prophets that are telling yarns and telling basically stories that are probably known to their audience, but they're putting them together in such a way that it makes a point. Okay? As we still do. When we celebrate Anzac Day in a couple of weeks' time, okay, we'll be rehearsing all the familiar stories, Simpson and his donkey, the stupid British officer class, all that stuff. We're not just wanting to tell each other what happened at Anzac Cove. Okay? We're telling a story about the kind of people we want to be and the kind of people we want our children to be. And so we're forming a culture, we're forming a society. We're not simply rehearsing the past. Very few people get excited about simply, digging up the past, rehearsing the past. But we can all be shaped by the story we get told. Okay, so this, I'm afraid, is going to be way too small, but I can zoom it up by this way. Okay, so it's just a way of letting you see, and this is also in the handouts, of course, if you download the thing. Basic idea, if you remember from Thompson, was that in these traditional chains, you start out with a set of 3 stories that basically introduce the key characters, give you a heads up as to what the underlying problem is, and also hint at the final resolution. Okay, so in this case, the introductory, and I've suggested there are 2 sets of traditional complex chain narratives about Samuel, the hero Samuel, who of course is the major character, at least in the first half of 1 Samuel. Samuel the prophet, chapters 1 to 3. Samuel the warrior, there's the man with the sword again, okay, in chapters 4 through 7. So let me just quickly give you a heads up, and you can look at this and sort of absorb it. So the introductory triplet for the case of Samuel the prophet is firstly the birth story for Samuel. This is the fact that Samuel's mum can't have a child, even though her husband's other wives are quite happily producing babies. So there's nothing wrong with him. There's something wrong with her. She can't have a baby. There's a fertility issue. And yet so she goes to the temple of God, which has not yet been built. Okay. And she says her prayers, and she's so intense in her prayers, the old priest, Eli, which is a word that means my God, okay, thinks she's drunk and ticks her off and tells her to, don't come in here when you're tipsy, drink with your husband at home, but don't disgrace the temple like this, okay? And so she says, I'm not drunk, I'm just really upset. I need a baby because my husband's favouring the other wives, sort of thing. So he says, this time next year you'll have a baby in your arms. And off you go. Okay. So, of course, the baby is born. So straight away we know, okay, whatever this kid is called, this kid is obviously going to be a special kid. In the story that follows, I mean, a baby that's introduced like that is somebody to watch. This is even better than interviewing the headmaster of the primary school when the person has become Prime Minister. Okay. Oh, he was always organising the cricket team and all that sort of stuff. Okay. Now this is even better. This is intervention even before conception. This kid is marked out as special. This next scene is the famous scene where Hannah, which of course is Anne, brings her one and only child after she's weaned him and gives him to Eli. If I was the grumpy old priest, I'd be going, 2-year-old, thank you. It's just what I need in the temple. God bless you, my dear. Have another drink. Okay? and take the kid home. But you know, this is a story. We're in a story world here, where it's a good thing for a mother to give her 2-year-old kid to the grumpy old priest to bring up in the temple. So this point is, this special child has now been dedicated to Yahweh. Belongs to God. Okay. All right. And he also has the name Shemuel, which means God listens, God hears. Okay. There's an even more interesting twist to the story, because in that first whole of first chapter 1, there's a word play, and I have called him Shemuel because I asked him from the Lord. Now in Hebrew that would work much better if you said, I called him Shaul, which is the word for ask, because I asked him of the Lord. So has somebody taken the birth story of Saul and hammered out, crossed out Saul and put in Shemuel? In other words, have they actually appropriated and recycled an earlier birth story because they want to use it for Samuel? We can never know. But actually, I've called him Shemuel because I Shaoled him. Doesn't work. I called him Shaul because I Shaoled him. That works. Okay? So there's those little irregularities in the text that make obsessive biblical scholars say, there's a source critical problem here. Okay? So the point is, the opening triplet of episodes, here is a kid to watch. His conception is miraculous. Okay? It's not a virgin birth, but this is a birth that only comes about because God intervenes. Then when the child is born, he's given to God. He's devoted to God, because that's what Samuel's going to be. Through his whole life, Samuel is the one given to God. And then finally we get this other episode where we hear what a bad job, what a disgusting job the sons of Eli are doing as they kind of work the old man's franchise to their own benefit. Okay? And that gives us a clue that actually where this story is going to end up, the house of Eli is out and the house of Shemuel is in. Okay? And then it goes through the story. Similarly, if you go to the second set of stories, chapters 4 through 7, the first episode is that Israel is defeated by the Philistines. So they said, okay, we'll fix this. So that introduces a problem, which is the Philistines are too advanced for us militarily. We cannot possibly defeat them on the field of battle. They're too good. They've got steel, they've got iron, and we have bronze. When I go to fight a man with a bronze shield and a bronze sword, and he has an iron shield and an iron sword, I end up holding a paper opener, a letter opener, because he's going to win every time. Okay? I just can't do it. Second episode is that okay, we'll get the Ark of the Covenant of Yahweh, and we'll bring it down to the military camp. Then we'll have our domesticated God with us, and we'll be invincible. And the third thing is, oops, the Philistines have captured the Ark of the Covenant. Oh dear, 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 what do we do now? Okay, well, we're going to get the Ark of the Covenant back, but we're going to do it through God intervening. And then there's a series of stories, some of which are a bit risque and mostly covered up in translation. Okay, but basically the gods of the Philistines become impotent and limp, and every morning they go in and they're all lying down in front of God instead of being erect and ready to go. So there's a really raunchy kind of story here, which most translations just kind of cover over. And by the end, Samuel brings about a reformation in Israel. He has victory over the Philistines, and Israel has peace during all the time that Samuel is their leader. So, and chapter 8, the people are going to say, you know what? We'd really like to have a king. Sorry? You want a king? You've got a prophet. He's a good guy. He's devoted to God. He does everything. He beats the Philistines. He brings the Ark of the Covenant back home, and he administers justice from Dan to Beersheba, and everybody's happy. And you want a king? Okay. And so that we get in chapter 8 a warning. You want a king? Well, this is what you're going to get. someone who takes your daughters for his collection in the harem, somebody who imports horses from Egypt, has an expensive lifestyle, etc., etc., etc. Okay? But what is that doing sitting right next? What is chapter 8 doing sitting right next to chapters 1 to 7? Chapters 1 to 7 are saying, you know, if we let the prophets run the place, not the priests, they get corrupt, not the king, they get abusive. If we let the prophets run the place, gee, it'd be good around here. But no, we want to have a king. Why do we want to have a king? Because we want to be like everybody else. Sorry? You want to be like everybody else? But you're the covenant people. You're Yahweh's people. You're not like everybody else. That's the point of being Yahweh's people. Okay? So there's a dialogue going on, okay, between the people that are shaping these traditional stories in order to make a point. And it's a bit like Animal Farm. You know, it's telling a story, but there's another whole other dynamic going on in this story. Okay? No, I don't actually want to join the library extension thing right at the moment. Who invited me? Thank you. Okay, so that's kind of what's going on. So I won't go into that in detail because of time, but you can see if we're paying attention to genre and also to redaction, we begin to see that this is not just stuff that's randomly put together or even simply been put together in chronological order. And obviously Samuel has to come before Saul, Saul has to come before David, and so on. But there's more to it than that. This is a much more sophisticated story than just saying, well, for 40 years they had Samuel, and then for 40 years they had Saul, and then for 40 years they had David. After we go, 40 again? Yeah. Why is everything either 40 days and 40 nights or 40 years? What is going on here? Can't you count in any other way? Okay? So there's all this stuff going on. So these are texts that invite us into their world, but they're telling us much more than just the content. There's a subtext. There's a message. And so in one very significant sense, I think the Jewish people are absolutely right to say these are prophets. These are prophetic texts. They're using history, but these are prophetic texts, not simply historical annals. Source criticism, yeah. Please, thank you. I'll get a drink.
The purpose, I suppose, of those Samuel texts is the transitioning between sort of the prophets and the kings and setting up that Davidic line down through to when Jesus is born.
Yeah, well, certainly the books are dealing with the transition period, and I mean the underlying reality is Israel did develop centralized social institutions, including a king. It did become like all the other nations. Now, whether it was ever all that different, of course, is a moot point. But Israel was a very small micro state, and state's anachronistic, but a small nation with a sense of identity, ruled by a hereditary ruler. It was not democratic, and there was no constitution. And it got wiped out, like all the other small Middle Eastern states did, by Babylon, Syria, Persians, whoever. I mean, that's what happened in that part of the world. So what happened to Moab and Edom and Ammon and Damascus and Tyre and Sidon also happened to Jerusalem and Samaria. So politically we can go, well, that's what happens if you're a little country caught between Egypt and Turkey. Yeah. Sooner or later, one of them is going to come in and say, by the way, we're in charge here, pay your taxes, we'll take it home. Now, there is this transition. One of the points is, so what are they saying? Was it a good thing to have kings? Or was it just inevitable? And that First Samuel is about trying to put some brakes on kingship, or at least frame kingship in a way that recognised covenant obligations. Now, of course, the people doing that are not thinking about Jesus. They're thinking about how to make sense of life in the Babylonian period or the Persian period or whatever. But people in the time of Jesus and shortly afterwards are reading the Jesus story in the light. And one of the ways they talk about Jesus, and one of the most popular ways of talking about Jesus in early Christian text, is to say that he's a son of David. Okay? In the historical Jesus inventory, I think it's number 7 out of 522. So it's one of the most highly attested elements in the Jesus tradition. And that, of course, is a New Testament question, not an Old Testament question, but to claim that Jesus is the son of David, unless you have already spiritualized that label, that's treason in the Roman Empire. Because to claim, and it's also treason within the Herodian kingdom, because Herod doesn't want any Davidic heir making a claim. He had enough trouble with the Hasmoneans, let alone a Davidic heir. Now, in fact, I think I'm right in saying there are no examples known to us from the Hellenistic period onwards. In other words, after the Persian period, there are no examples known to us of a Davidic pretender to the Jewish throne. So that idea dies out as a genuine political idea. But the idea that the future messianic king would be a Davidic descendant takes on a whole life of its own, and it has been spiritualized and theologized, and it's become a mythic hope for the future. So in that sense, the sort of issues that Samuel and Kings are wrestling with at a very, this has just happened in our own time type situation, several hundred years later, there's no option of having a king. I mean, the empires are in charge. Everybody gets that. But one day God will give us a king. And when that king comes, he will be from the house of David. Okay? So it's interesting that even though I think I would read 1 Samuel as being pretty negative towards kings, but by the end of the story, as in the end of the Old Testament or whatever, nobody is quibbling anymore about whether or not to have a king. That's just how it's done. So that debate between the prophets and the palace won, and then the palace got wiped out. So the prophets came back. But when they come back, they talk about a future king. They don't talk about a future prophet. So they've actually bought onto the royal program, even though there's no longer a royal person. Interesting. Is that a question forming?
Where do judges sit in this?
Oh, well, they're even earlier than
narrative?
Samuel,
Yeah,
of course.
So
Yeah.
just come across, and what are the prophets saying? Look, with sort of the pinnacle, you had the judges, they didn't work. Samuel was a really great leader, and then you asked for a king.
Well, this gets Can you hold that one, because we'll come to that, and because I've tended to jump in with Samuel because of looking at some literary examples, but we do need to look at Joshua, Judges, Samuel, Kings, and you're right. The bigger picture, because Joshua is about conquest and taking it. It's ours. God gave it to us. The rest of you cut your throat or run away. Judges is saying, well, actually, it wasn't quite that simple. They're still here, and it's a mess, and we keep falling into trouble, and so there's this cycle. And then you begin to see, then you get the emergence of royal leadership. So in a sense, Samuel is the last of the judges, okay, and the best from the point of view of the person writing Samuel. And of course, they didn't call the book Samuel. I mean, that's just what we call it. But it's not that they said, I'm going to write a book and I'm going to make it about Samuel and he's going to be the top character and it's going to be a bestseller and all that stuff. Okay, that wasn't how this sort of literature got written. So, yes, they're using. It's pretty clear that the redactor has used older material and even maybe, reworked some of the material, changed a few names here and there. And indeed, there are places where they say, if you want to know more about so-and-so, look it up in the annals of the kings of Judah. So they footnote their sources at times. Okay, they tell you where to go. Unfortunately, none of those other documents have survived. So we can't look, at least not yet. Okay, we might find them next week in a cave outside Jerusalem. But as of today, we don't have the Book of the Wars of Yahweh, thankfully, probably. And we don't have, the Chronicles of the Kings of Israel and so on. And if we did, they would be subjected to the same critical analysis as any other ancient text. But at least they're footnoted, so they're conscious that, this stuff is written down somewhere else, but I'm telling you the story this way, because I'm trying to get across to you. Okay, so we get things like, it's possible, for instance, there's what appears to be a very well-developed, coherent story about David's rise to power. That almost certainly existed long before the books of Samuel were put in their present form. It's a coherent story with its own dramas and so on. You get the stories about the ark, comings and goings of the ark. You particularly get the Elijah and Elisha cycles, which again would have circulated and had their own coherence long before they got drawn into the end of First Kings, beginning of Second Kings. And they're complex characters in their own right, especially Elijah. He didn't like getting called baldy by a group of little boys, so he cursed them in God's name, and a wild bear came out of the forest and killed the boys because they called him bald dome or chrome nut or whatever. We used to always call our deputy principal names like that. We never got attacked by bears because we got detention, but it's different, I suppose. Okay, so then we go into questions. So yes, there are probably sources that are being used, but someone is pulling it together. And the critical issue here is the role of the Deuteronomists. So the major scholarly view would be that Joshua, Judges, Samuel, Kings is actually part of a continuous work of which Deuteronomy is volume 1. Okay. Now, for whatever reason, the way the books have come down to us and been received as scripture, Deuteronomy belongs in Torah, and Joshua, Judges, Samuel, Kings are not. They're part of the prophets. Okay. It's a little bit like the problem we have in the New Testament with the Gospel of Luke and the Acts of the Apostles. Almost certainly they're two parts of the same book. But as they've come down to us, Luke lives amongst the Gospels, and Acts of the Apostles goes with the Pauline letters, because it's about Paul's journeys. So it's been transmitted and preserved separately. So there's something like that going on here. And there are various reasons as to why that might have happened. And one might simply have been as simple as in the Persian period, when the empire is in charge, Deuteronomy reads well as a reaffirmation of the fundamental values of Judaism. It's about Torah, it's about obedience, da-da-da-da-da. But as soon as you get into Joshua, Judges, that's about carving out your own empire. And the king of Persia is not very happy about that. Thank you very much. So the Secretary of State for Jewish Affairs in the Persian administration authorises the publication of Genesis through Deuteronomy as the Torah. His name was probably Ezra. And the other books, Joshua, Judges, Samuel, Kings, are kind of quietly circulating, but they don't gain the same public authority that the Torah has. Okay. Now we don't know it was Ezra, but certainly Ezra is called the scribe of the law of the God of heaven, which is probably probably Persian public service business card code for Secretary of State for Jewish Affairs. Okay, he was the royal official responsible for running the Jewish community within the Persian Empire. And historically or not, he's connected with the publication of the Pentateuch, of the Torah. Now, ever since the important work done by Martin Noth in 1943, most Old Testament scholars have accepted the idea, a bit of refinement here and there, that one person has been responsible for shaping Deuteronomy through to Kings. And it's called the Deuteronomistic history. And with enough practice, you can get your tongue around all these words. The Deuteronomist, Deuteronomistic, and so on. And so Deuteronomy through Kings. Then one of the questions is, so is Deuteronomy to Kings a sequel to Genesis to Numbers, or is Genesis to Numbers the prequel to Deuteronomy to Kings? Okay, and how would we ever answer that question? Okay, but even to ask it is to say, let's not think that just because there's a logical sequence, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, Joshua, Judges, that doesn't mean the books were written in that order. And there are some good reasons for thinking that Deuteronomy to Kings actually is a coherent body of work, and that Genesis to Numbers might actually have been a response to the Deuteronomic history, and then subsequently Deuteronomy kind of hooks up with Genesis to Numbers and becomes Torah, and Joshua to Kings becomes part of the prophets. Because the other thing is the prophets, where do the prophets do their stuff? In the story that we find in Joshua, Judges, Samuel, Kings. Okay, these prophetic texts, the former prophets, give you the historical context of the real prophets, if you like.
Is there a defining moment or a reason, evidence for why Deuteronomy was classified as Torah rather than being part of this work by itself? Because obviously that's what the Jewish people see it as.
Yeah.
The Torah.
And we have no. That's what I was alluding to a minute ago. But we have no. There are no literary examples of Deuteronomy except as part of the Torah,
Okay.
and that's the same as Luke Acts.
Yeah.
There are no examples in ancient. Nobody until like 100 years ago ever suggested that Luke Acts were originally one continuous work. They knew it was the same person writing, but they just took them as two different books, like Corinthians and Romans, sort of thing. So while New Testament scholars get very excited, and now Luke-Acts has become, everybody just talks about Luke Acts as if there's no argument anymore. That's a modern literary theory, and there's absolutely no ancient documents that support them ever circulating that way.
Mm-hmm.
Similarly for Deuteronomy, we only ever have it as part of the Torah. Nobody ever says, "Gee, in the olden days, Deuteronomy." It's a modern theory.
So there's no evidence that predates its existence as Torah to then justify
It's purely internal literary analysis that
Okay.
Deuteronomy to Kings hangs together in a whole lot of ways, in a way that Genesis to Numbers do not, or that Genesis to Deuteronomy do not.
Yeah.
But equally, even as early as, say, the Samaritan Schism, whenever we think that was, they have Genesis to Deuteronomy. I mean, everybody has Genesis to Deuteronomy. Just the Old Testament scholars think it was Deuteronomy to Kings. And we must be right. Okay. So basically, Deuteronomy through to Kings, or even indeed Genesis through to Kings, is seen as Israel's primary history. And it's been that at one point in time we could imagine Genesis to Kings as that's the story of who we are. Okay? But that of that total set of books, Genesis to Deuteronomy emerged as the Torah. And although there are literary continuities between Deuteronomy and Joshua, there are very big differences. I mean, Deuteronomy is still out in the desert. You're still across the river. You're not yet in the land. It's all about taking the inheritance, taking the promise, but you're not yet got it. Okay? Very different thing than going in and saying, actually, according to Joshua 6, this farm belongs to me. On your bike, out of here. Okay? That tends to make for, as we're seeing in the modern world, that disrupts the community relationships in Palestine. Okay. So some sort of Deuteronomistic redaction seems likely, and we see that particularly in these kind of speeches: Joshua 1, Joshua 23, 1 Samuel 12, 2 Samuel 7, 1 Kings 8. A number of Deuteronomistic speeches, which are to the Deuteronomistic history, have a similar kind of role as the speeches in the book of Acts, which I would suggest have been composed by Luke to provide an appropriate speech for Paul or Peter or whoever to say on that occasion, because that's how ancient Greek historians were trained to do their craft. If Socrates is giving a farewell speech before he dies, well, what would a philosopher say when he's about to drink the hemlock? Write a speech. That's a schoolboy exercise. Okay? Our problem is we want those speeches to be the actual words said by the person, rather than appropriate words for us to imagine that person saying in those circumstances. Okay? Because we're fixated on history. Then we get some other narrative bits which are also thought to be the work of the of DTR, which is not a character from Star Wars. It's the Deuteronomistic redactor, DTR. Okay. So the point is here it appears that whoever is giving us Deuteronomy is also giving us Joshua, Judges, Samuel, Kings. They're not making it up in the middle of the night by candlelight. They're using traditional material, but they're pulling it together and shaping it and dropping in some great speeches here and there for key characters so it all hangs together. Because they're preaching. Okay? They're giving a lecture. Trying to get a point across. Okay. Now, and I don't want to spend a lot of time on this because we've already spent a lot of time on other things already, but obviously there's a whole set of issues when we come to Joshua, Judges, Samuel, Kings about historical and social science issues. This is the battleground. This is ground zero for the argument about the historicity of the Old Testament. Okay. Genesis through Exodus has basically been surrendered by all but the most recalcitrant conservatives. Yep.
Could you say a bit more about the key battleground for the...
That's what I'm doing right now. That's what I'm doing. Yep. Okay. So Genesis, so the historicity of Genesis and Exodus has basically been surrendered. Okay. You find the occasional strange person with vertical commas around strange who will try and argue that they've found the root of the crossing of the Red Sea or whatever, but that's about as scientific and respectable as finding Noah's Ark. Okay, and in some circles that's still a big deal, but in most of the world and in all scholarly circles, nobody goes looking for Noah's Ark, and nobody's looking for the pond that Excalibur was thrown into. But when we get to Joshua and when we get to David, then we're playing for sheep stations. And in the case of modern Israelis, you really are playing for the sheep station, because they want to say God gave this land to us and we're taking it back. Okay, so it's a genuine debate. And equally, why is there so much archaeological activity going on in Israel? Well, apart from the fact that where else are you going to find biblical archaeology? But I mean, but it wasn't happening there 100 years ago. It wasn't happening there 500 years ago. There's a huge political and social investment in digging up the title deeds to the land, okay, and claiming their roots in the land. And it is actually, I find it fascinating to be driving through northern Israel, but any part of Israel. The area that I drive in a lot happens to be Elijah territory. Now Elijah the Tishbite, okay, but one of the interchanges I come to is the Tishbe interchange. Okay, it's the intersection in Tishbe where Elijah comes from. So the modern street signs are littered with Old Testament names. Okay, and for understandable reasons, Israeli town planners and so on are reverting from Arab names or Western names or other names that have grown up, and they're going back to the biblical names for these places because they're putting that stamp on the place. Okay, they're claiming this history as part of their claim to the present, and that's perfectly understandable. There are good ways, there are just and humane ways of doing that, and there are unjust and inhumane ways of doing that. Okay, and at the moment Israel is tending to adopt the unjust and violent ways, but that's their call. And look what we did to the indigenous people here. So no scholars are seriously defending the historicity of Abraham, the historicity of the Tower of Babel, of Joseph in Egypt, any of that stuff, or indeed the historicity of the Exodus. That's all been surrendered to the infidel skeptics, okay? But the debates are still swirling around Joshua and David, and not so much Joshua as the bigger question of, so where did the Israelites come from? How did they get here? Who were they? Did they come from outside, or were they just Canaanites who changed their postcode? Okay, and so there are various debates about different models for the emergence of Israel. And of course debates around the historicity of David are very hot at the moment. And this takes us into the war between the maximalists and the minimalists, and to your great pleasure and delight you have a minimalist as your lecturer. Okay, so you're perfectly entitled to be maximalists, but it's only fair you know where I'm coming from. Now the excavations at Bethsaida, as it happens, sit right in the middle of all this, because we're digging up material from the 900s and the 800s and the 700s BCE. Okay, so it takes us right into the heartland of what was happening in Palestine and in the Iron Age 2 period, because Iron Age 2 is the period of the Old Testament biblical kingdoms. Okay, suffice to say, even though most of my colleagues at Bethsaida are not minimalists, they're mostly Jewish for starters, but they're very excited about the possible links between Bethsaida and the time of David, because it's possible this is the capital city of David's father-in-law. This is a place David stayed. This is where his son Absalom ran away when he went into exile and so on, okay? However, and I can buy all that, even with my minimalist hat on, I can buy all that, okay? However, this was not a town David controlled. This was a city empire he had to marry into for an alliance. This was somewhere he could run away, or his son could run away, because it was outside the jurisdiction of Jerusalem. And the people that lived there were not Yahwehs, they were not Israelites. They didn't worship Yahweh, they worshipped the bull god, the moon god, and so on. And they were in fact Arameans. Of course, Deuteronomy 26, a wandering Aramean was my father. All right, the Old Testament knows that the origins of Israel's people were the Aramean migrations. Aram is, of course, Syria, the kingdom of Aram, with Damascus its capital. So the Israelites are Syrians. Nobody wants to know that. Nobody in Israel wants to hear that, and nobody in Damascus wants to hear that. Okay? That ethnically, culturally, politically, religiously, the Israelites are simply Arameans, Syrians that developed a unique religious idea. So this is the kind of historical debate going on, and there are lots of things in the Old Testament that preserve that tradition, but the Old Testament also imagines David having a kingdom that stretched from Egypt to Babylonia. Well, that was news to the king of Geshur, who married his daughter off to David and maintained his own kingdom and was not in any sense subject to David. Okay? So hence you get all this debate. And I think I might have mentioned one somewhere else recently, there are people can find the tiniest scrap of archaeological remains and on the so-called city of David, and even how we name pieces of archaeological territory, of course, is a political claim. So to call a particular ridge south of the Temple Mount, the city of David, already presupposes a whole lot of stuff about what you're going to find there. So if you can find a corner of a large building from the Iron Age, well, you've obviously found David's palace. Well, no, you haven't. You found the corner of a large building. Okay? But if you're looking for David, you've found him. If you don't think David was there, you're not convinced. So you get the debate backwards and forwards. Okay? So that's the maximalist and minimalist stuff. And so, yeah, there's a understanding the Iron Age in Canaan, or the Iron Age in Palestine, is very important for understanding what was happening for ancient Israel and what was happening in the neighbours around. And it coincides with a period when the big empires were in decline. And so the micro-states of Palestine and the Levant and Syria were able to flex their muscles. And then a couple of hundred years later, the big powers woke up and reasserted their influence, as they had always done, and the little powers get squeezed between the Egyptians and what we'd now say the Iraqis. Okay? Or indeed the Iranians, in the case of the Persians. So we're not just looking at Iron Age Canaan, Iron Age Palestine to test the historicity of the Bible. Sure, a lot of people, when biblical archaeology first developed, literally they had the Bible in one hand and the spade in the other. And they were looking for evidence of the historicity, which they perceived to be the same as the truthfulness of the Bible. Okay? So discovering Jericho, yay, look at this, there are walls that have fallen down. They must have been the walls Jericho that were knocked down by Joshua. No. Actually, it's from 1,000 years earlier, if you date them correctly. So these were not the walls. But there was a memory that once upon a time the walls of Jericho had fallen down, and surely Joshua is the best guy for that to have happened with, because he's our hero. Okay? So there's all this kind of swirling debate, and the big stuff, the really important stuff, I think, is not the historicity of this event or that person, but can we understand the dynamics of Iron Age Palestine, Iron Age Canaan? And how does that help us read Joshua, Samuel, Kings in a way that go, aha, got it. Now we can see why David's fighting the Philistines or whatever. because they just arrived too and they wanted the country. So, get it. What is going on here? I'm not sure why this is coming up today when it's not come up any other time. Let's turn off Wi-Fi. That'll kill it for sure. Okay. So, we've done that page. Let's move on to the text itself. Whoop. Okay, so if we're looking at the actual story world, what's in this story as we go through Joshua, Judges, Samuel, Kings? Well, Joshua is the story of Israel entering the land and taking it by conquest. And the first few chapters, as you can see, are focused around the capture of Jericho, a strategic location, southern end of the Jordan River, just above the Dead Sea, and just at the point where you turn right to head towards the coast. Okay, so you had to have control of Jericho. It also had fresh water and date palms and other things. You then have to capture the central hill country, which these days we call the West Bank. And then you do a quick mission to the south and a quick mission to the north, and you've got the whole place. And then there are lists of which tribe gets which patch. And then there's a great farewell speech by Joshua, carefully written for him by the Deuteronomist. And then there's a covenant ceremony where they all make a covenant treaty with Yahweh about how they're going to follow the law and put away their other gods that we served. Our fathers served other gods beyond the river. Joshua 24. But as for me and my house, we will serve the Lord. Joshua 24. Okay? So it's fantastic. The book coheres. It's a great storyline. Historians come along and unpick it, but that's okay. As a book, it works. And we're now in the world of the text, not the world of the archaeologist. And that story may cause other issues for us, but that's the story they tell. Then we get the story which says, what was like before we had kings? Well, it was awful, is what Judges is saying. It was just one crisis after another. Minority government, minority government, minority government, okay? Nothing was working. The trains weren't even running on time. We didn't even have trains. Okay. So we get this, so the Judges 1 and 2 sets up the scene, and then we get a whole series of stories over about 12, 15 chapters about different heroes or deliverers who we tend to call judges, and that's unfortunate in a sense because they're not official representatives of the law. There's no separation of crown and court and parliament and so on. These are shofetim. These are administrators of justice. Okay, and so these are the people that arise from time to time to push off the people oppressing and to liberate one part or other of Israel. And in no case are we dealing with all 12 tribes. It's very patchy. It's different bits of the country, different groups of people. And then we get two really weird bits. 17 and 18 are a whole lot of stories about the tribe of Dan, and it's quite clear nobody in later Israel liked Dan. So they're spreading all this nasty story about Dan. So that by the time you get down to the early patristic period and people speculate on where the Antichrist is going to come from, guess which tribe the Antichrist is going to come from? Dan. Okay? They've had a bad rap for thousands of years. So they upset somebody and they've been written into the script in very negative terms. And then there are traditions about the tribe of Benjamin as well. And Benjamin, which means sons of the right or southerners, is in it because they're actually in the middle of the southern half of the West Bank, just north of Jerusalem. So it's like calling somebody a Mexican, a southerner. So whoever's telling the story about the Benjaminites is from further north, because they're talking about the southerners. Okay. And it's basically a period of chaos, of ups and downs, and really providing the theological and political justification for strong central government, is what Judges is doing in a literary term, quite apart from historical terms. One of the judges, of course, was Deborah. So you have women's ordination in the Old Testament. The leaders were not necessarily males. Okay? They were just competent people who responded to a crisis. And it's a wonderful scene because Barak is meant to be in charge. This is up at on the plain of Jezreel at the foot of Mount Tabor, and he will only go to battle if Deborah will come with him. And he says, well, I'll come, but I'll get all the credit, you won't. I'll only go if you come with me. Okay, darling, hang on to my skirts, let's go. And then we have the books of Samuel Kings, which in the Septuagint are 1st, 2nd, 3rd, 4th kingdoms. That's what they're called. So they're seen as one continuous book, whereas Joshua Judges have their separate identities. And as you can see, there are a couple of major characters. The first third of 1 Samuel is about Samuel. Then there's a whole lot of traditions, of course, about Saul. But Saul's story is quickly overshadowed by the rise of David, which is from 1 Samuel 16, of course, right through into 2 Samuel, and in particular, he comes to power and everything by 2 Samuel chapter 8. And then we get a fascinating story through the rest of 2 Samuel into the 2nd chapter of 1 Kings, which is the succession struggle within the house of David. Now, in the end, Bathsheba and Solomon win. Okay, but there are various other brothers and various other wives whose sons have to be got rid of in order for Solomon to come through. Okay, and it's one of the most interesting things about David's rise to power, and particularly the succession narrative, is that while David is clearly a hero, David sitting right in front of me. I'm talking about this David, but there's a David with warts and all his foibles, all his shortcomings are being portrayed. Now, probably not all his shortcomings, but I mean, he doesn't get a complimentary, subservient kind of presentation. He's presented in ways which show him as being far from perfect. But far from perfect though he was, he's presented as the person after God's own heart. He's the person God loves, God respects. Okay? So that's interesting. You don't have to be perfect. You just have to be in there and available and so on, giving it your best shot.
So why the 1 Samuel, 2 Samuel named after Samuel when he dies partway through 1 Samuel?
It's just traditional.
Yeah.
Like in the Septuagint, it's First Kingdoms, First Book of Kingdoms, Second Book of Kingdoms, Third Book of Kingdoms, Fourth Book of Kingdoms. So the Septuagint and the Latin Vulgate don't have the Samuel name, but in the Jewish tradition, Samuel is the major character at the beginning of the book. And with ancient scrolls, you tend to, like, the names of the biblical books, particularly for the Pentateuch and so on, are actually named after the first word that occurs in the Hebrew text. When you first start to unroll a scroll, that's what you see. That's why we call the Magnificat, because it's the first word of that song in Latin. And the Nunc Dimittis, because it's the first phrase in now, Lord, now you can let, and so on. So in the ancient filing system, where you couldn't go Apple F or whatever, okay, you basically took the first word. In the case of Joshua and Samuel, they've taken the major character in the first scene and done it that way. So it's just how it's happened. So as you go through Samuel and Kings, you can see David and Solomon dominate the script. They get a massive amount of the content. Then there's a pretty short period, like it is only it's the last 8-10 chapters of 1 Kings, the first 17 chapters of 2 Kings, which is the rest of the story, including Northern Kingdom and Southern Kingdom, until the Southern Kingdom disappears, 722, and then the last couple of chapters, 18 through 25, the Northern Kingdom is gone, and we're just focusing on the collapse of the Southern Kingdom, the final years of the Kingdom of Judah. So that's the kind of literary world. The major characters, people like Joshua, some of the judges turn out to be, household names to this day. Gideon, Deborah, Samson, Samuel, of course, Saul, David and Solomon, Elijah and Elisha, and of course Josiah. Now, one of the other things to note, and it does come out here a little bit, which is probably why I just thought of it, when you're reading the Old Testament, and we certainly had this in morning prayer this morning, reading the Old Testament, you start getting to all those names that end with I-A-H. Well, that's Yah. These are Yahweh names. Interesting. The characters in the earlier bits of the Old Testament do not have Yahwistic names. Not even David has a Yahwistic name. Certainly not Saul. Okay? But even some of David's sons, like Adonijah, which means Yahweh is Lord. So once you're in Jerusalem, once you've got the temple cult, once you're starting to kind of pull stuff together in that way, we begin to see Yahwistic names. So Isaiah, Jeremiah, Zephaniah, Zechariah, all these names. And some of those other names we heard in morning prayer this morning. If they end with IAH, or if they start with Yek or Yak, the Yah at the beginning. Okay, so we get this clustering of Yahwistic names for the characters in the biblical text, and they're typical of the late Iron Age period in Jerusalem, with the temple project underway and the emergence of Yahwism as the dominant religion within Israel. Whereas the earlier characters, even Moses, does not have a Yahwistic name. And Joshua, Jacob, Abraham, none of them have Yahwistic names. The Yahweh names occur, and they're just as common in the north as they are in the south. Okay? So it's something about Israelite identity that the Yahwistic tradition is coming through, and we see it in some of these characters. Joshua, for instance, is Yahweh saves. Okay. So what's coming through in terms of major theological themes in the world of the text is the significance of Jerusalem. Up until, we go through all the stuff in the Old Testament, Genesis, Joshua, Judges, nobody cares a fig about Jerusalem. It might be mentioned in passing once or twice, like Genesis 14, where it talks about Salem, the king of Salem, which could be Jerusalem, Melchizedek. And then once or twice in Judges there's a reference to how they didn't worry about Jerusalem that was held by the Jebusites. And Saul's not interested in Jerusalem, but David wants Jerusalem, according to the story. Okay, and then of course once David's got Jerusalem, everybody wants Jerusalem, and they still do. Okay. We want Jerusalem to be the capital of our Palestinian state. There is no way we will share Jerusalem. It's the eternally undivided Jewish city, etc., etc. Okay? So something that is still with us today as a major factor in terms of potential disaster, like sooner or later the Iranian missiles are going to arrive, the Israeli planes are going to attack, and it's about Jerusalem. It's this icon of we want to possess the holy city. Okay, and the Crusades were about the same thing. So on, okay? So it's a struggle that continues to our own time, and it has its roots in the stories we're dealing with, particularly in Kings. 2 Samuel, 1st, 2nd Kings. And of course it's picked up in Chronicles, where it's like there's no other city on earth besides Jerusalem. It's all about Jerusalem. Nothing else counts. Okay. All right. Let's see if we can just quickly knock this off before our break. So Joshua Kings is telling a story about Israel's past, and indeed these books from ancient Israel, whether they were finished before the time of the exile or finished during the time of the exile, they're amazing literary, cultural achievements, and even more so if they're written during the exile, because then there's no government printing office and propaganda department to support the people working on this project. Okay, and there's nothing else like it that has survived from the ancient world in the Middle East, and the nearest analogies are the very early Greek historical works of Herodotus and Thucydides and so on, and they're going to be around 600 BCE, which is approximately the time we're dealing with here as well. So maybe the Jerusalem cultural elite was not as isolated from the Mediterranean culture as we might like to think. There's something going on around about 600 BCE. Okay, it's presenting a critique of royal power. It's not just a wealthy person going on his big international trip, coming home and publishing his diary. And it understands that the power of the ruler is constrained by the covenant with Yahweh. Hence the prophetic dimension of these texts. Okay? So it's, in a sense, I've suggested here, it's a theology of historiography. It's actually seeing storytelling as having an inherently theological value. Telling the story is also about framing how we're going to go from here, reflecting. If you like, it's reflective practice in a way. Okay, it's a story with a message. So just very quickly, if we're going to look at how we might read, what are some of the issues as we engage with the former prophets now? Well, I could easily spend the rest of the day talking with you about biblical archaeology, but I will resist that temptation. At least I'll try. But there's our fascination with historicity and the amazing investment. I mean, think about it. In 6 weeks, 8 weeks' time, I'm going to be taking 20, 30 people across to dig in the midday sun like crazy Englishmen, while the Israelis sit in their taverns having cold drinks. And we come and dig up their history for them and say, here you go, here's your heritage. Now, they're in there doing it as well, but thousands of volunteers from all over the world will come to Israel in their summer to put their energy and their love and their enthusiasm into digging up Iron Age or Herodian or Roman history from Palestine, okay, from ancient Israel. That's actually weird, right? I love it, but I mean, there's something really weird going on there. It's something beautiful and something crazy, and it's not an innocent task. I mean, when a Palestinian village gets bulldozed to make way for an archaeological dig so we can dig up the fact the Jews were here 3,000 years ago, something wrong there, okay? And the Jewish farmer whose dairy farm has been decimated because we took out, sort of 20 acres for the Bethsaida dig, he's not very happy either, okay? So there are issues about ethnic cleansing and sacred violence, of course. There are issues about, if you read this stuff, it looks like God's constantly involved making stuff happen, and she seems to be on long service leave because we seem to live in a world where miracles don't happen like that. There are issues around Zionism. And, there's Jewish Zionism, there are Christian Zionists, there are people that oppose Zionism, but Zionism on one level is one expression of a Jewish national identity and a desire to have a particular place where that community of people can call home. Okay, so how do we deal with that as Christian people, where place and national identity is no longer important to us as people of faith? May matter to us as Aussies or whatever, but as Christians we don't have the same attachment to ethnicity and to place. So what theological value do we give to the idea that the land belongs to the covenant people? Let alone how you would then implement that in a way which honours God and loves God and loves your neighbour. So how do we interface claims to the land with the two great commandments? How do we marry all that together? Okay? And it's not by chasing all the Jews into the ocean, and it's not by chasing all the Arabs across the Jordan and dumping them in Jordan. What's the answer? Then there's the prophetic critique of those with power. There are some churches, indeed there are many churches around the country, our country now, that are increasingly outspoken about refugees and asylum seekers. Okay? The Gosford Anglican Church, for instance, is a zinger. Its weekly notice board is always worth checking on Facebook. Okay, but and we know we can imagine just how much Mr. Morrison enjoys being criticised by the churches for his treatment, our treatment of asylum seekers. But this is the issue, isn't it? How do we speak out of our theological values to people in power who are, have other agendas that they're trying to pursue? What's the role? What's the relationship between the prophet and the king? Okay, between the people of faith and the people with power, and that gets way more complicated when you live in a multi-faith society, which is intentionally secular. So if we were in a Christian country, God help us, okay, that you know, discriminated against people who weren't Christians and said all laws passed through Parliament had to be vetted by the Archbishop of Sydney before they take effect or whatever, okay, then we could say, well, the Christian religion has a recognised role to play in the public politics of the nation, but we don't. But we do. Because part of our faith is that it matters and God cares. And so how do we nuance all that to have a constructive, positive role? And how do we do it in a society where the Christian voice is not the only religious voice and the Christian community is not the only religious community?